Well, good evening, folks. How are you? I see a few familiar faces out here. It's good to see you. I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're having a good summer so far. It's starting to get warm and them skeeters are getting me, and, well, at least I got my coffee. It's not too bad that way. Well, this evening, folks, I'm going to tell you some more of that story by Max Brand. The Untamed, TRAILIN the Night Horseman. We're up to chapter 19. Seems like one of them had run off and into the desert, and the other one was fixing to run off into the desert. Well, let's just see what happens here. We're going to start with chapter 19, like I say. Name of that chapter is Suspense. Well, he found him as he'd expected, the girl beside the couch and the old man prone upon it, wrapped to the chin in a gaudy Navajo blanket. But tonight, his eyes were closed, the most unusual thing. And Byron would look more closely at the aged face. For on occasions when the eyes were wide, it was like looking into the throat of a searchlight to stare at the features. All was blurred. He discovered now wrinkled and purple-stained lips under the deep shadow of the brows, and eyes were so sunken that there seemed to be no pupils anywhere. Over the cheekbones, the skin was drawn so tightly that it shone, and the cheeks fell away into a cadaverous hollows. But the lips, beneath the shag of gray beard, were tightly compressed. No, this wasn't sleep. It carried, as Byron gazed, a connotation of swifter, fiercer thinking, than if the gaunt old man had stalked the floor and poured forth a tirade of words. The girl came to meet the doctor. She said, "Will you use a narcotic?" "Well, why?" asked Byron. "He seems more quiet than usual." "Look more closely," she whispered. And when he obeyed, he saw that the whole body of Joe Cumberland quivered like an aspen, continually. So the finger of the duelist trembles on the trigger of his gun before he receives the signal to fire. A suspense more terrible than the actual face of death. "A narcotic," she pleaded. "Something to give him just one moment of full relax." "I can't do it," said Byron. "If his heart were a shade stronger, I should, but as it is, the only thing that sustains him is his force of willpower. Do you want me to unnerve the very strength which keeps him alive?" She shuddered. "Do you mean that if he sleeps, it will be death?" "Well, I've told you before," said the doctor, "that there are phases of this case which I do not understand. I predict nothing with certainty, but I very much fear that if your father falls into a complete slumber, he will never waken from it. Once let his brain cease functioning, and I fear that the heart would follow suit." They stood on the farther side of the room and spoke in the softest of whispers. But now the deep, calm voice of the old man broke in. "Doc, they ain't no use of worrying. They ain't no use of medicine. All I need is quiet." "Do you want to be alone?" asked the girl. "No, not so long as you don't make no noise. I can most hear something, but your whispering shuts it off." They obeyed him with a glance at each other, and soon they caught the far-off beat of a horse in rapid gallop. "Is it that?" cried Kate, leaning forward and touching her father's hand. "Is that horse what you hear?" "No, no," he answered impatiently. "That ain't what I hear. It ain't no hoss that I hear." The hoofbeats grew louder. Stop before the house. Stop sounded loud and rattling on the veranda. A door squeaked and slammed, and Buck Daniels stood before them. His hat was jammed down so far onto his eyes they were almost buried in the shadow of the brim. The bandana at his throat was twisted so that the knot lay over his right shoulder. He carried a heavy quirt in a hand and trembled so that the long lash seemed alive. 1,000 bits of foam had dried upon his vest and stained it. The rowels of his spurs were caked and enmeshed with horsehair. Dust covered his face, and sweat furrowed it, and a keen scent of horse sweat passed from him through the room. For a moment, he stood at the door, bracing himself with legs spread wide apart, and stared wildly about. Then he reeled drunkenly across the room and fell into a chair, sprawling at full length. No one else moved. Joe Cumberland had turned his head. Kate stood with her hand at her throat. The doctor had placed his hand behind his head, and there it stayed. "Give me smoke, quick," said Buck Daniels. "Run out of Durham 1,000 years ago." Kate ran into the next room and returned instantly with papers and a fresh sack of tobacco. On these materials Buck seized frantically, but his big fingers were shaken in a palsy, and the papers tore, one after another, as soon as he started to roll his smoke. "God!" he cried in a burst of childish desperation, and collapsed again in the chair. But Kate Cumberland picked up the papers and the tobacco which she had dashed to the floor and rolled a cigarette with deft fingers. She placed it between his lips and held the match by which he lighted it. Once, twice, and again he drew great breaths of smoke into his lungs, and then he could open his eyes and he looked at him. They were not easy eyes to meet. "You're hungry, Buck," she said. I can see it at a glance. I'll have something for you in an instant." He stopped her with a gesture. "I done it," said Buck Daniels. "He's coming." The doctor flashed his glance upon Kate Cumberland, for when she heard the words she turned pale, and her eyes and her lips framed a mute question. But Joe Cumberland drew in a long breath and smiled. "I knowed it," he said softly. The wind whistled somewhere in the house, and it brought Buck Daniels leaping to his feet and into the center of the room. "He's here!" he yelled. "God help me, where'll I go now? He's here!" He had drawn his revolver and stood staring desperately about him as if he sought for a refuge in the solid wall. Almost instantly he recovered himself, however, and he dropped the gun back into the holster. "No, not yet," he said, more to himself than the others. "That ain't possible, even for Dan." Kate Cumberland rallied herself, though her face was still white. She stepped to Buck and took both of his hands. "You've been working yourself to death," she said gently. "Buck, you're hysterical. What have you to fear from Dan? Isn't he your friend? Hasn't he proved it 1,000 times? Her words threw him into a fresh frenzy. "If he gets me, it's blood on your head, Kate. It was for you I done it." "No, no, Buck. For Dan's sake alone. Isn't that enough?" "For his sake?" Buck threw his head back and laughed, a crazy laughter. "He could rot in hell for all of me. He could foller his wild geese around the world. Kate, it was for you." "Hush," she pleaded. "Buck, dear, do I care who knows it? Not I. I got an hour, half an hour to live. And while I live, the whole damned world can know I love you, Kate. From your spurs to the blue of your eyes. For your sake I brung him, and for your sake I'll fight him, damn him, in spite." The wind wailed again, far off, and Buck Daniels cowered back again the wall. He had drawn Kate with him, and he now kept her before him, towards the door. He began to whisper, swiftly, and with a horrible tremble in his voice. "Stand between me, Kate. Stand between me and him. Talk for me, Kate. Will you talk for me?" He drew himself up and caught a long, shuddering breath. "What have I been doing? What have I been raving about?" He looked about as if he saw the others for the first time. "Sit here, Buck," said Kate with perfect quiet. "Give me your hat. There's nothing to fear. Now tell us." "A whole day and a whole night," he said. "I've been riding with fear of him behind me. Kate, I ain't myself. And if I've been saying things, well, no matter. Only tell me how you made him follow you." Buck Daniels swept his knuckles across his forehead as though about to rub out a horrible memory. "Kate," he said in a voice which was hardly more than a whisper, "why did he follow Jim Silent?" The doctor slipped into a chair opposite Buck Daniels and watched him with unbelieving eyes. When he had last seen Buck, the man had seemed an army in himself. But now, a shivering, unmanned coward sat before him. Byron glanced at Kate Cumberland for explanation of the mysterious change. She, also, was transformed with horror, and she stared at Buck Daniels, as at one already among the dead. "Buck, you didn't strike him?" Buck Daniels nodded jerkily. "I'll try to tell you straight from the beginning. I found Dan in Brownsville. I begged him to come back with me, but he wouldn't stir. This was why. A gunman had come to the town looking for trouble, and when he run across Dan, he found plenty of it. Nah, don't look like that, Kate. It was self-defense, pure and simple. They didn't even arrest Dan for it. But this dying man's brother, Mac Strand, he come down from the hills and sat beside Jerry Strand, waiting for him to go west, before he started out to clean up on Dan. Yesterday evening, Jerry was near dead, and everybody in Brownsville was waiting to see what would happen, because Dan wouldn't budge till Mac Strand had had his chance to get back at him. So I sent a feller ahead to fix a relay of hosses to Elkhead, because I'd made up my mind I was going to make Dan Barry chase me out of that town. I walked into the saloon where Dan was sitting, braiding a little horsehair strand. My God, Kate, think of him sitting there doing that with 100 fellers standing about waiting for him to kill or be killed. Now I went up to him, I picked a fight, and then I slapped him in the face. "But you're still alive," cried Kate Cumberland. "Had you handled his gun first?" "No. As soon as I hit him, I turned my back to him and took a couple of steps away from him." "Oh, Buck, Buck," she cried, her face lightening. "You know he wouldn't shoot you in the back." "I didn't know nothing. I couldn't even think. My body was numb as a dead man's all below the hips. There I stood like I was chained to the floor. You know how it is in a nightmare when something chases you and you can't run? Well, that was the way with me." "Buck, and he was sitting behind you while you stood there?" "Aye, sitting there with death sitting on his trigger finger. But I knowed that if I showed the white feather, if I let him see me shake, he'd be out of his chair and on top of me. No gun. He don't need nothing but his hands. And what was in front of my eyes was a death, like Jim Silence." He squinted his eyes close and groaned. Once more he roused himself. "But I couldn't move a foot without my knees buckling, so I takes out my makings and rolls a cigarette. And while I was doing it, I was praying that my strength would come back to me before he would come back to himself, and started." "Well, it was surprise that held him, Buck, to think of you striking him. You who have saved his life and fought for him like a blood brother. Oh, Buck, of all the men in the world, you're the bravest and the noblest." "Well, they ain't nothing in that brand of talk," growled Buck, reddening. "Anyway, at last I started for the door. It wasn't farther away than from here to the wall. Outside was my hoss and chance of her living. But that door was 1,000 years away. And 1,000 times while I walked towards it, I felt Dan's gun click and bang behind me. And I felt the lead go tearing through me. And I didn't dare to hurry, 'cause I knew that might wake Dan up. So finally I got to the doors, and just as they was swinging to behind me, I heard a sort of a moan behind me." "From Dan?" whispered the white-faced girl. "I know. A sort of a stifled cry when he's angered. Oh, Buck. My first step took me 10 yards from that door," reminisced Buck, "and my next step landed me in the saddle, and I dug them spurs clean into the insides of Long Bess. She started like a watch spring uncoiling, and she spurts down the street. I leans over clean over to her mane and looked back to there I seen Dan standing in the door with his gun in his hand, the wind blowing in his hair. But he didn't shoot, because the next second I was swallowed up in the dark and couldn't see him no more." "But it was of no use," cried the girl. "With Black Bart to trail you and with Satan to carry him, he overtook you. And then?" "He didn't," said Buck Daniels. "I'd fixed things so he couldn't get started with Satan for some time. And before he could have Satan on my trail, I'd put a long stretch behind me, because Long Bess was racing every step. The lay of the land was with me. It was pretty level, and on level going, Long Bess is almost as fast as Satan. But on rocky going, Satan is like a goat. Nothing stops him. And I was riding Long Bess like to bust her heart straight toward Macaulay's. We wasn't more than a mile away when I thought, the wind was behind me, you see, that I heard a sort of a far-off whistling down the wind. My God! He couldn't go on for a moment, and Kate Cumberland sat with parted lips, twisting her fingers together and then tearing them apart once more. Well, that mile was the worst in my life. I thought maybe the man I'd sent on ahead hadn't been able to leave me a relay at McCauley's, and if he hadn't, I knew I'd die somewhere in the hills beyond. And they looked as black as dead men and all sort of grinning down at me. But when I got to McCauley's, there stood a hoss right in front of the house. It didn't take me 2 seconds to make a saddle change, and then I was off again. A sigh of relief came from Byron and Kate. That hoss was a beauty. Not long-legged like Bess, nor half as fast, but he was just right for the hills. He climbed like a goat, and he didn't let up. Up and up we goes. The wind blows the clouds away when we gets to the top of the climb, and I looks down into the valley all white in the moonlight, and across the valley I've seen 2 little shadows just a sliding smooth and steady. It was Dan with Satan and Black Bart. Buck! My heart, it stood plumb still. It gives my hoss the spurs, and we went down the next slope. And I don't remember nothing except we got to the Circle K bar after 1,000,000 years. Most. And when we got there, the piebald flops on the ground, near dead. But I made the change and started off again, and that next hoss was even better than that piebald, a sure goer. And when he started, I could tell by his gait what he was, and when I looked up at the sky, he stopped, embarrassed. And thank God, Buck? Kate, I ain't ashamed if maybe I did. But since then, I ain't neither seen or heard Dan, but all the time I rode, I was expecting to hear his whistle behind me, close up. All the life died from her face. No, Buck, if he'd have followed all the way, he would have caught you in spite of your relay. No, I understand what happened. After a while, he remembered that Max Strand was waiting for him in Brownsville. And he left your trail to be taken up later and went back to Brownsville. You didn't see him follow you after you left the Circle X bar, did you? No, I didn't care to look back. But somehow, I knew he was coming. She shook her head. He won't come, Buck. He'll go back to meet Max Strand. And then... She ran to the chair of Buck swiftly and caught his hands. What sort of man is Max Strand? But Buck smiled strangely up into her face. Does he make any difference to Dan? She went slowly back to her place. No, she admitted. No difference. If you came by relays for 24 hours, said the doctor, numbering his points upon accurate fingertips, it is humanly impossible that this man could have followed you very closely. It will probably take him another day to arrive. But here his glance fell upon old Joe Cumberland and found the cattleman smiling faintly to himself. Buck Daniels was considering the last remark seriously. No, he said, it ain't possible. Besides, what Kate says may be true. She ought to know. She says he'll wait for Max Strand. I didn't think of that. I thought I was saving Dan from another... Well, what a damn fool I've been. He knotted his bandana with it and mopped his face for a semblance of cleanliness. It was the riding that done it, he explained, shamefaced. You put a man on a hoss for a certain time, and after a while he gets so that he can't think. He's sort of nutty. And that was the way with me when I come in. Open the window on the veranda, said Joe Cumberland. I want to feel the wind. The doctor obeyed the instruction, and again he noted that same quiet, the contented smile on the lips of the old man. For some reason it made him ill at ease to see it. He won't get here for 8 or 10 hours, went on Buck Daniels, easing himself into a more comfortable position, raising his head just a little bit higher. 10 hours more, even if he does come. That'll give me a chance to rest up. Right now, I'm kind of shaky. A condition, you will observe, in which Mr. Barry will also be when he arrives, remarked the doctor. Shaky? Grinned Buck. My friend, if you don't know that bird... He sat up, clenching his fist. And if Dan does come, he can't afford to press me too far. I'll take so much, and then... He struck his fist on the arm of the chair. Buck, cried Kate Cumberland, are you mad? Have you lost your reason? Would you face him? Buck Daniels winced, but he then shook his head doggedly. Now he had his chance down in Brownsville, he said, and he didn't take it. Why? Because my back was turned? Well, he could have got in front of me if he'd have been terrible anxious. I seen Dan in action. He's seen me in action. Maybe he's seen too much. There's been stranger things than that in this world. Hitched his belt so that the butt of his revolver came farther forward. But now, Kate Cumberland advised, Buck, you're tired out. You don't know what you're saying. You better go up to bed. He flushed a ruddy bronze. Do you think I'm just talking words, Kate, to hear myself talk? Listen, broke in Joe Cumberland and raised a bony forefinger for silence. And the doctor noted a great change in the old man. There was no longer a tremor in his body. There was only a calm and smiling expectation of certainty. A tinge of color was in his weathered face for the first time since Byron had come to the ranch. And now the cattleman raised his finger with such an air of calm authority that at once every voice in the room was stilled. Do you hear? Well, they did not. They heard only the faint rushing of the air through the window. The flame danced in the chimney of the lamp and changed the faces in a fantastic alteration. One and all, they turned and faced the window. Still, there was not a sound audible, but the doctor felt as if the noise were approaching. He knew it as surely as if he could see some far-off object moving nearer and nearer, and he knew as clearly that the others in the room felt the same thing. He turned his glance from the window towards Kate Cumberland. Her face was upturned. There was about it a transparent pallor. The eyes were large and darkly ringed, the lips parted into the saddest and most patient of smiles, and the slender fingers were interwoven and pressed against the base of her throat. And for the first time, he saw how that fire that was so manifest in the old man had been consuming her also. It left no mark of the coming of death upon her, but it had burned her pure and left her transparent as crystal. Pity swelled in the throat of Byron as he realized the anguish of her long waiting. Fear mingled with his pity. He felt that something was coming which would seize on her as the wind seizes on the dead leaf, whirling her off into an infinity of storm and darkness, into which he could not follow a single pace. And he turned back towards the window. The rush of air played steadily and then in pulses upon his face. Then even the wind ceased, as if it, too, were waiting. Not a sound, but silence has a greater voice than discord or music. It seemed to Byron that he could tell how fast each heart was beating. The old man had closed his eyes again, and yet the frigid forefinger remained raised, and the faint smile touched at the corner of his mouth. Buck Daniels sat lunging forward in his chair, his knees supporting his elbows, and scowled up at the window with a sort of a sullen terror. Then Byron heard it. So small a voice that at first he thought it was only a part of the silence. It grew and it grew, and in a sudden burst it was clear to every ear, the honking of the wild geese. And Byron knew the picture they made. He could see them far up in the sky, a dim triangle of winter gray, moving with the beat of lightning wings, each in an arrowy flight north and north and north. Creatures for sport all the world over, here alone, in all the earth, in the heart of this mountain desert, they were in some mysterious wise messengers. Once more the far discord showered down upon them, died as they rose, perhaps, to a higher level, and was heard no more. Chapter 20. The Coming. Then a padding step, lighter than the sound of the softest thought. It was passing near. The faint breeze blew the sound to them, around them, behind them. Each man felt as if some creature were stalking him, unseen. Next, it appeared by magic against the blue-black of the night. The head of a great wolf, quite black, shaggy, with sharply pointed ears. and the eyes stared at them, green eyes with lights that swirled as the flame jumped in the throat of the lamp. For a long moment, the horror lasted. Then the head, as it had come, disappeared, and the light footfall faded away. Buck Daniels had risen now. The sound of his whisper made them start. "I'm going up to my room and lock the door. For God's sake, keep him away." And so he stole soundlessly away. And then they heard the creaks which announced his progress up the stairs. Well, not Buck Daniels alone. In the deadly silence, Kate rose to her feet, and the old man, the invalid, he with the dead body and the living brain, rose from his couch and stood as erect as a soldier on parade. The doctor was conscious of repeating to himself, hurriedly, a formula something like this: "That thing which is coming is human. It cannot be more than human. As long as it is human, there's nothing to fear. The laws of truth are irrevocably fixed. The laws of science will not change." Yet in spite of all this formula, he was deadly cold, as if a wind were blowing through his naked soul. It was not fear. It was something beyond fear. And he would not have been any otherwhere for any reward. All his mind remained poised, expectant, as the astronomer waits for a new star, which his calculations have predicted entered the field of his telescope. Well, he caught the sound of another horse coming, far different even to his unpracticed ear from the beat of hooves which announced the coming of Buck Daniels. The rhythm of their fall was slower, as if the stride of the animal was much longer. He pictured a mighty creature with a vast mane blown back against the chest of a giant rider. There was a murmur from Kate. "Dan, my dear, my dear." Then he heard a padding footfall, hardly louder than the light step of the wolf. The knob of the door turned slowly, without a sound. It opened, and a man stepped in. He was not larger than the doctor, a slender feller, almost dapper in his dress, with hardly a sign of travel about him, except that the brim of his sombrero was folded back from his face, as if from a continual pressure of wind. These things Randall Byron noted vaguely. What he was sharply aware of were the eyes of the man. He had the feeling that he had seen them before. He remembered the yellow light that had swirled in the eyes of the wolf at the window. The newcomer flashed a glance about the room, yet for all its speed it seemed to linger an instant on each face, and when it crossed the stare of Byron, the doctor shrank back. "Where's Buck?" asked the man. "I've come for him." As if in answer, the great shaggy dog slipped through the entrance past his master and glided across the room. And as he passed, Kate held out a hand to him. She called softly, "Bart," but she was greeted with a silent baring of fangs, and she caught her hand back against her breast, with the tears springing in her eyes. On the other side of the room, the black dog paused and looked back to his master, while Byron realized with a shudder that the door before which it stood was the door through which Buck Daniels had disappeared. Straight to that door Barry stepped, and Byron realized with an eerie emotion that the footfalls made no sound. Before he reached the door, however, the girl started forward and sprang before him. With her outstretched arms, she barred the way. Her skirt brushed almost in the face of the dog, and the beast shrank away, not in fear, but crouching in readiness to leap. The sharp ears twitched back. A murderous snarl rolled up from between the wicked teeth. Yet she did not cast a single glance at him. She faced the greater danger. She was saying, "Whatever Buck did, it wasn't done to hurt you, Dan. It was done for your own sake and for Dad's sake. You shan't pass here." From his position, the doctor could not see the face of Dan Barry, but he guessed at it through the expression of Kate. Such terror and horror were in her eyes, as though she was facing a death's head inches away. Then he saw the slender hand of Barry rise and move towards the girl. Slowly, tremblingly, as though one fierce impulse urged him to thrust her to one side, as though another held back his arm. The doctor could not watch the girl longer. Fear and pity were wringing him as he lowered his glance to the floor. Then he heard her cry, "Have you forgotten me? Like Bart? Have you forgotten me, Dan?" His hand fell to his side and he glided back from her. But now Byron could see that the eyes of Barry were looking past the girl, as though he stared through the solid wood of the door and found his prey beyond. The stranger slipped towards the door by which he had entered, and with the great dog slinking at his heels. Kate Cumberland leaned heavily against the wall, her arm thrown across her face. There was no consciousness of her in the face of Barry. Yet at the very door he paused and he straightened. Byron saw that he was staring towards Joe Cumberland, and the old man reached a bony hand out. "Oh, lad," he said softly, "I've been waiting for you years and years, seems like." Barry crossed the room as noiselessly, as swiftly as a flying shadow. "Sit down," he commanded, and Byron caught a faint ring in the voice like the shiver of metal striking steel. Joe Cumberland obeyed without a word, and then lay back at full length upon the couch. A palsy had seized on him, and the hand which rested on the shoulder of Dan Barry was shaking. By the couch came the tall dog and crouched, staring up in the master's face. Then the younger man turned his face towards Byron and the girl. Those thin-cut nostrils expanded, the lips compressed, and Byron dared not look into the flare of the eyes. "Who done this?" asked Barry, and still the shiver of cold metal rang in his voice. "Who's done this?" "Steady, lad," said Joe Cumberland faintly. "There ain't no call for fighting. Steady, Dan, boy, and don't leave me." Byron caught a signal from Kate and followed her obediently from the room. "Let them be alone," she said. "Impossible," protested the doctor. "Your father has lapsed into a most dangerous condition. The physical inertia which has held him for so long is now broken, and I look for a dangerous mental and nervous collapse to accompany it. A sedative is now imperative." He laid his hand on the knob of the door to return, but the girl blocked his way. "Don't go in," she commanded feebly. "I can't explain to you. All I can say is that Dad was the one who found Dan Barry, and there's something between them that none of us understand. But I know that he can help Dad. I know Dad is in no danger while Dan's with him." "A pleasant superstition," nodded the doctor. "But medicine, my dear Miss Cumberland, does not take account of such things." "Dr. Byron," she said, rallying a failing strength for the argument, "I insist. Don't ask me to explain." "In that case," he answered coldly, "I cannot and will not assume responsibility for what may happen." She made a gesture of surrender, weakly. "Look back in on them now," she said. "If you don't find Father quiet, you may go in to him." Dr. Byron obeyed, opening the door softly. He saw Joe Cumberland prone, of course, upon the couch. One hand lay as usual across his breast, but the other was at his side, clasping the hand of Dan Barry. The old cattleman slept. Yes, there was no doubt that for the first time in many days he slumbered soundly. The lean, narrow chest rose and fell with deep, slow breaths. The eyes were closed, and there was no twitching of muscles to betray ragged nerves or a mind that dreamed fiercely while the body slept. And far over the sleeping man leaned the stranger, as if he were peering closely into the closed eyes of Joe Cumberland. There was a tenseness of watching and waiting in his attitude, like the runner on the mark, or like the burden-bearer lifting a great weight, and Byron gathered in some mysterious manner the impression that Barry sent through his hands and into the body of Cumberland a continual strength of nervous strength, an electric thing. Nonsense, of course, and it was nonsense also to think that the huge dog which lay staring up into the face of his master understood all this affair much better than the practiced mind of the physician. Yet the illusion held with Randall Byron in spite of all his skepticism. He was certain that he had made not the slightest sound in opening the door, but presently the head of the watcher turned slowly, and Byron was looking into those same yellow, terrible eyes. At the same instant the sick man moaned faintly. The doctor closed the door as softly as he had opened it and turned a drawn face upon Kate Cumberland. "I don't understand. It isn't possible," he whispered. "No one understands," said the girl, and smiled mirthlessly. "Don't try to, Dr. Byron. Go to bed and sleep if you can. Good night." "But you," said Byron, following her, "are almost as ill as your father. Is there nothing I can do for you?" "You?" she asked, surprised. "No, nothing. But there's not the slightest color in your face, and you are trembling, Miss Cumberland." She did not seem to hear him. "Will he stay?" she asked of herself. "Will he leave before the morning?" "I shall see that he stays," said the doctor. "I will stay here outside the door and see that he does not leave, if that's your wish." Once more she smiled in that baffling manner. "Could you keep the wind from blowing, Dr. Byron? If I thought that he could be kept—" She stopped. "He has forgotten us. He has forgotten all of us except Dad. And if Dad cannot keep him, nothing will keep him. It's useless for you to wait here. Good night again, Dr. Byron." He watched her up the stairs, and by the dim light he saw her hand catching at the balustrade as if she were drawing herself up step by step. And when she reached the landing and turned half towards him, he saw that her head had fallen. "Not a glance, not a thought for me," murmured the doctor. "But if the stranger does leave—" Instead of finishing the muttered sentences, he drew a chair back against the wall and sat down with folded hands to wait. Well, now, isn't that something? This story just keeps getting gooder and gooder, huh? Well, let's have us another one of those drinks. I see there's some coffee over here. I'm headed for it right now. Anybody else got to tell a story? Now's the time. Yeah, okay, go ahead then. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to head on out, at least for this week. Maybe I'll see you again. Maybe I'll be here tomorrow. It'd be fun, just like it always is, folks. So till then, this is Clay Steele. Good night.